The Mongol Empire did not advance like a typical army. It moved like a system. Cities did not resist it. They were erased by it. Kingdoms did not negotiate with it. They were dismantled, reorganized, and absorbed. From the plains of Eastern Asia to the edges of Europe, the Mongol war machine had proven something unprecedented in medieval history. No army, no matter how disciplined or numerous, had yet found a reliable way to stop it. By the middle of the 13th century, this reality was no longer debated. It was feared. Baghdad, once the intellectual and symbolic heart of the Islamic world, had fallen in 1258. Its libraries burned, its population massacred, its Abbasid caliph executed. The destruction was not simply military. It was psychological. The message was unmistakable. Even the greatest centers of civilization could be annihilated. And after Baghdad, the Mongol armies did not pause. They continued west. Their objective was not a single city or a border dispute. It was continuity, momentum sustained across continents. The Mongol command structure had evolved into something highly adaptive, capable of projecting force across immense distances while maintaining cohesion. Their generals operated with autonomy, but within a shared doctrine built on speed, deception, and overwhelming violence. At the forefront of this Western advance was Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. His campaigns had already redrawn the political map of the Middle East. Persia had been subdued, Mesopotamia devastated. Syria now stood exposed. The cities of Aleppo and Damascus would soon follow Baghdad's fate. But the Mongol advance was not merely a sequence of victories. It was a pressure system. Each conquest displaced populations, shattered alliances, and forced neighboring powers into impossible decisions. Some rulers chose submission, hoping to preserve fragments of authority under Mongol oversight. Others attempted resistance, often too late, and with insufficient coordination. The result was fragmentation. And fragmentation was exactly what the Mongols exploited. To the southwest, another power observed these developments with growing alarm. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Unlike the fractured states of the Levant, the Mamluks represented a centralized military regime, forged through internal discipline and constant readiness. Their ruling class was not hereditary nobility, but a corps of elite slave soldiers, men trained from youth in warfare, bound by loyalty to their institution rather than lineage. Their leadership was pragmatic, often ruthless, but acutely aware of strategic reality. They understood what the Mongol advance meant. It was not a distant threat. It was approaching. Cairo, the seat of Mamluk power, became a center of urgent deliberation. Reports from Syria described Mongol detachments moving methodically through the region, supported by local auxiliaries and reinforced by their reputation alone. Resistance was sporadic and largely ineffective. Cities opened their gates preemptively, calculating that submission might spare them destruction. But the Mamluks faced a different calculation. Submission was not viable. Their political structure depended on military dominance. To submit would not preserve their authority. It would dissolve it. The Mamluk state existed because it could fight. Without that capacity, it would cease to function. So the question was not whether to resist. It was how. At the center of this decision stood Sultan Qutuz. His rise to power had been abrupt, shaped by internal instability and external threat. He was not a ruler with the luxury of gradual reform or diplomatic maneuvering. His authority depended on immediate results. And the situation he inherited was stark. The Mongols had reached Syria. Egypt was next. Qutuz faced a strategic dilemma. The Mongols had not yet committed their full strength to the region. Hulagu Khan, after securing his initial conquests, had withdrawn a significant portion of his forces eastward following the death of the great Khan in Mongolia, a political event that required attention from the imperial elite. This withdrawal created an unusual condition. The Mongol presence in Syria remained formidable, but it was no longer overwhelming. For the first time, there was a possibility, however narrow, that a well-coordinated force might confront them on something approaching equal terms. But opportunity did not eliminate risk. The Mongol detachments left behind were led by experienced commanders, most notably Kibuka, a general with a record of disciplined execution and loyalty to Mongol strategic principles. His forces, though reduced, retained the core advantages that had defined Mongol warfare: mobility, coordination, and psychological dominance. They were still capable of destroying unprepared armies. And Qutuz knew this. The decision he made would define the coming confrontation. He chose to advance. Rather than waiting for the Mongols to push deeper into Egyptian territory, Qutuz ordered the mobilization of Mamluk forces and began preparations for a northward campaign into Palestine. This was not a defensive posture. It was preemption. The logic was clear. To allow the Mongols to dictate the terms of engagement would be to fight on their terms, open terrain, extended maneuver, and strategic initiative. Instead, Qutuz sought to control the battlefield, to choose when and where the confrontation would occur. But this required more than movement. It required coordination, intelligence, and discipline under pressure. The Mamluk army that began assembling was not vast by Mongol standards, but it was experienced. Its core consisted of heavily trained cavalry units, supported by mounted archers and auxiliary forces. Unlike many of the fragmented armies that had fallen before the Mongols, the Mamluks operated under a unified command structure with clear lines of authority and communication. Their training emphasized not only combat skill but cohesion, an understanding of how units function together under stress. This would prove critical. Yet even as preparations advanced, uncertainty remained. The Mongols had not been decisively defeated in open battle by any Islamic force. Their reputation alone had shaped outcomes before swords were drawn. Entire cities had surrendered based on expectation rather than experience. The Mamluks would be confronting not just an army, but an idea that had, until now, remained unchallenged. To the north, Kitbuka monitored developments. His position in Syria was not passive. He maintained pressure on the region, securing supply lines and reinforcing Mongol authority through continued operations. His forces included not only Mongol cavalry, but also allied contingents, Armenians, Georgians, and others who had aligned themselves with Mongol expansion. He understood the terrain. He understood the enemy. And he understood that the Mamluks were not likely to submit. This awareness shaped his posture. He did not retreat. He prepared. Between these two forces lay a landscape that would soon define the outcome of their decisions. The region of Ain Jalut, situated in the Jezreel Valley, offered a mix of open ground and constrained approaches, terrain that could either favor mobility or restrict it, depending on how it was used. For an army built on speed, this mattered. For an army seeking to disrupt that speed, it mattered even more. As the Mamluk forces advanced northward, they entered a space where every movement carried consequence. Scouting units probed ahead, gathering information on Mongol positions and behavior. Commanders adjusted formations, anticipating contact. Supplies were managed carefully, as extended operations would strain logistics. There was no room for miscalculation. The Mongols did not forgive errors. And yet, for all the preparation, one factor remained unpredictable: human response under pressure. The soldiers who would soon face each other at Ain Jalut were not abstractions. They were individuals operating within systems, trained, disciplined, but still subject to fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. The Mongol reputation had psychological weight. The Mamluks carried the burden of confronting it. Leadership decisions would matter, but so would perception. A moment of hesitation, a misread signal, a breakdown in coordination. Any of these could cascade into collapse. By late summer of 1260, the conditions for a confrontation had aligned. Two forces shaped by different traditions but equally defined by discipline were moving toward a single point. Neither could fully predict how the other would act. Neither could afford to be wrong. At Ain Jalut, the Mongol system would meet something it had not yet encountered in the region, an army that understood both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. And that understanding would begin to reshape the balance of power. The Valley of Ain Jalut did not appear decisive at first glance. It was not a fortified city, nor a symbolic capital. There were no walls to breach, no gates to storm. Instead, it was a stretch of land shaped by natural contours, low hills, patches of woodland, and narrow approaches that opened into wider ground. To an untrained observer, it was simply terrain. To experienced commanders, it was an opportunity. The Mongol army, under command of Kitbuka, approached this landscape with confidence shaped by years of uninterrupted success. His force, though smaller than earlier Mongol invasions, retained its essential structure. Light and medium cavalry formed its core. Mounted archers capable of rapid maneuver, coordinated strikes, and sustained pressure at range. Their tactics were not improvised. They were rehearsed systems executed with precision. The Mongol method relied on control of tempo. Engagements were rarely static. Units advanced, withdrew, feigned collapse, and reformed, all while maintaining communication across the battlefield. Their ability to fragment an enemy formation, isolate segments, and destroy them in sequence had defined their victories from Central Asia to the Middle East. Kitbuka understood this system intimately. He had no reason to abandon it. Opposing him, the Mamluk army advanced with a different composition and a different set of expectations. Their cavalry was heavier, their formations more compact. While they too employed mounted archers, their doctrine placed greater emphasis on close engagement at the decisive moment. Shock action delivered with timing rather than continuous harassment. Their commanders did not seek to match Mongol mobility. They sought to control it. Among them was Baybars, one of the most capable field commanders in the Mamluk ranks. His experience had been shaped by both internal conflicts and external threats. He understood not only how Mamluk units operated, but how they might respond under pressure. More importantly, he had studied Mongol tactics, not as an abstract system, but as a recurring pattern: speed, encirclement, psychological disruption. To counter this, he would need to disrupt their expectations. The Mamluk command structure reflected a deliberate approach. Kutuz retained overall authority, but operational control in the field was distributed among trusted commanders. This allowed for flexibility, but also required discipline. Units had to act in coordination, even when direct communication became difficult. This balance between autonomy and control would soon be tested. As the two forces moved closer, reconnaissance became critical. Mamluk scouts observed Mongol movements, noting their formations and patterns of advance. They reported a force that was confident, aggressive, and prepared to engage on open ground, conditions that typically favored Mongol tactics. But Ain Jalut was not entirely open, and that distinction would shape the coming engagement. Baybars moved ahead with an advanced contingent. His role was not to initiate a full confrontation, but to provoke one. The objective was precise: draw the Mongol forces into a controlled engagement, shape their movement, and guide them toward terrain where their advantages could be constrained. This required discipline not only in execution, but in restraint. A premature commitment could unravel the entire plan. On the Mongol side, Kitbuka observed the Mamluk advance with measured interest. Initial contact came through skirmishes, probing attacks, exchanges of arrows, limited engagements designed to test reactions. These were familiar patterns. The Mongols had encountered similar resistance before, often from forces attempting to delay or disrupt their advance. Typically, such resistance collapsed under sustained pressure. There was little indication at this stage that this encounter would differ. The first significant movements unfolded with calculated tension. Baybar's forces engaged, then withdrew, not in disorder, but with intention. To Mongol observers, this resembled a familiar scenario: an enemy unable to withstand pressure, beginning to retreat under attack. It was a pattern they had exploited repeatedly: pursue, accelerate, fragment, destroy. Kitbuka responded accordingly. He ordered an advance. The Mongol cavalry surged forward, maintaining formation while increasing speed. Mounted archers began their work, releasing volleys designed to disrupt and weaken the withdrawing Mamluk units. The distance between the two forces narrowed, then shifted, then narrowed again as pursuit intensified. From the Mongol perspective, the battle was unfolding as expected. Momentum was building, but within the Mamluk ranks, the withdrawal was controlled. Signals were relayed. Units adjusted spacing, maintained cohesion, and moved toward predetermined positions. This was not a retreat driven by panic. It was a maneuver executed under pressure. The distinction was subtle, but critical. As the Mongol forces advanced deeper into the valley, the terrain began to influence their movement. The open space narrowed. Visibility shifted. Lines of sight became less predictable. These were not dramatic changes, but they introduced friction, small disruptions in the clarity that Mongol commanders relied upon to coordinate complex maneuvers. Kitbuka pressed forward. The logic remained sound. maintain pressure, prevent the enemy from reorganizing, exploit perceived weakness. Every previous campaign had reinforced this approach. And yet, something was different. The Mamluk forces were not breaking. They were yielding space, but not cohesion. The moment of transition approached gradually. Baybar's advance contingent, having drawn the Mongols into position, began to alter its behavior. The pace of withdrawal slowed. Units shifted orientation. What had appeared as retreat began to resemble preparation. For a brief interval, the battlefield existed in ambiguity. Was the enemy still withdrawing, or was it preparing to turn? This ambiguity carried risk. For the Mongols, hesitation could dissipate momentum. For the Mamluks, premature action could expose them to encirclement. Both sides operated within this tension. Then, the Mamluk response began. From concealed positions and prearranged formations, additional Mamluk units emerged. Their presence had been masked by terrain and timing. Now, they moved to engage, closing angles, reinforcing a line, and beginning to apply pressure not as a reaction, but as an initiative. The battlefield shifted. What had been pursuit became confrontation. The Mongol advance encountered resistance that did not fragment. Instead, it absorbed impact and held. Mounted archers continued their volleys, but the expected collapse did not follow. The Mamluk formations adjusted, shields and armor mitigating some of the impact, while their own archers returned fire in coordinated bursts. Distance narrowed further. At closer range, the nature combat changed. The Mongols, still highly effective, found their maneuver space constrained. The terrain, combined with positioning of Mamluk units, limited the sweeping movements that had previously allowed them to encircle and isolate opponents. Instead of expanding the battlefield, they were being drawn into a more contained engagement. Kit Booker responded with aggression. He committed additional forces, seeking to reassert momentum and break the Mamluk line before it could stabilize. This decision was consistent with Mongol doctrine. Intensify pressure at the point of contact, prevent the enemy from consolidating. But this also meant committing deeper into a space that offered less flexibility. Within the Mamluk command, the timing of response was critical. Kutuz, observing the engagement, waited. He did not immediately commit his full reserve. The initial phases had unfolded according to plan, but the decisive moment had not yet arrived. To act too early would risk diluting the impact. To act too late would risk losing control. This was the narrow margin within which the battle would be decided. Meanwhile, across the field, individual experiences diverged from the clarity of command decisions. For soldiers within the formations, visibility was limited. Dust movement and the rapid exchange of attacks created a fragmented perception of events. Signals could be misinterpreted. Units could lose alignment. The distinction between controlled maneuver and disorder could blur quickly. Maintaining cohesion under these conditions required not only training, but trust in leadership, in formation, in the actions of those nearby. The Mongol system, built on coordination and speed, began to encounter resistance that did not behave as expected. The Mamluks were not collapsing under pressure. They were absorbing it and preparing to respond. By the time the engagement reached its midpoint, the initial assumptions on both sides had been tested. For the Mongols, the anticipated rapid disintegration of the enemy had not occurred. For the Mamluks, the challenge of containing Mongol mobility without losing cohesion remained ongoing. The outcome was still uncertain, but the structure of the battle had changed. By the time both armies were fully engaged at Ain Jalut, the clarity that had defined the opening phases had begun to dissolve. Formations were no longer moving in clean lines. Signals were harder to interpret. The terrain, once a strategic consideration, had become an active constraint. For Kitbuka, the situation demanded resolution. The Mamluk forces had absorbed the initial advance. They had not fragmented. More importantly, they had not retreated beyond recovery. Instead, they had stabilized, and in doing so, they had disrupted the rhythm of Mongol warfare. Momentum, once the Mongols' most reliable weapon, was no longer entirely theirs. Kit Booker responded as Mongol commanders had been trained to respond. He escalated. Additional units were committed into the engagement, reinforcing pressure along the central axis where resistance appeared strongest. The objective was direct: break the Mamluk line through sustained force, restore operational freedom, and reassert control of the battlefield. This decision carried weight. To commit deeper was to narrow the margin for maneuver, but to hesitate was to risk losing initiative entirely. Kit Booker chose commitment. Across the field, Kutuz observed the same development from a different perspective. The Mongol advance had extended itself, not recklessly, but sufficiently. The distance between their forward elements and their ability to disengage cleanly had grown. Their formations, though still disciplined, were operating under increasing friction. Coordination required more time. Adjustments were slower. For the first time, the Mongol system was not operating at optimal efficiency. This was the moment Kutuz had anticipated, and it would not last. He ordered the advance. The Mamluk reserves, held back until this point, moved forward with deliberate force. This was not a scattered reinforcement. It was a concentrated release of strength, directed precisely where the Mongol advance had committed most heavily. The effect was immediate, but not chaotic. Pressure increased along the Mongol front, not as a sudden shock, but as a sustained escalation that began to compress their movement. Space narrowed further. Opportunities to maneuver laterally diminished. The battlefield, once fluid, was becoming constrained. Baybars coordinated the forward elements, aligning them with the advancing reserves. The Mamluk line did not surge blindly. It tightened. This distinction mattered. Rather than expanding into open pursuit, the Mamluks maintained cohesion, advancing in a way that reduced gaps and reinforced mutual support between units. Their objective was not speed. It was control. They were no longer reacting to Mongol movement. They were shaping it. For Mongol units accustomed to operating in open maneuver, this shift introduced a critical problem. Their tactics depended on space. Space to withdraw, to reposition, to encircle. Without that space, their effectiveness diminished. They could still fight, still deliver precision attacks, but their ability to dictate the terms of engagement was eroding. The terrain that had once been a pathway now became an obstacle. Movement was hindered. Lines of retreat were contested. The same features that had constrained Mongol maneuver now constrained their withdrawal. Kit Booker remained with his forces. His command did not dissolve into absence. But leadership alone could not reverse the structural conditions that had developed across the battlefield. Eventually, resistance concentrated into smaller, isolated engagements. Pockets of Mongol troops continued to fight with discipline, but without the coordinated system that had defined their strength. The larger formation no longer existed as a unified force. By the time the battle reached its conclusion, the outcome was no longer in question. The Mongol army at Ain Jalut had not been annihilated in a single blow. It had been compressed, constrained, and gradually broken apart. Kit Booker was captured and executed. His defeat marked more than the loss of a commander. It marked the first decisive defeat of a Mongol field army in the region. The implications extended beyond the battlefield. For the Mamluks, the victory was not simply military. It was existential. They had confronted a force that had, until then, appeared unstoppable, and had found a way to defeat it not through numerical superiority, but through controlled terrain, timing, and discipline under pressure. Their state, built on military cohesion, had justified its existence. For the Mongols, the defeat introduced a new variable. Their system, though still formidable, was not invulnerable. It could be disrupted, it could be constrained, and under certain conditions it could be defeated. Ain Jalut did not end Mongol expansion, but it altered its trajectory. The advance into Egypt was halted. The balance of power in the region stabilized, not permanently, but decisively enough to prevent immediate collapse. In the years that followed, both sides would continue to adapt. The Mongols would refine their approaches in the Middle East, incorporating lessons from this engagement. The Mamluks would consolidate their position, strengthening their defenses and expanding their influence. But the memory of Ain Jalut remained, not as a sudden reversal, but as a demonstration of something rare in that era, that a system built on momentum could be stopped if an opposing force understood not only how it moved, but where it could be made to slow and finally to break.